So there's this phenomenon. It's known as high place phenomenon. And it's this terrifying feeling, this sense that some people have as they get near the edge of a cliff face or the railing of a tall building. And it's not exactly a fear of heights, but maybe something that's all the bit more concerning. It's the fear that they might actually jump. So what sort of otherwise mentally healthy individual would even consider ever throwing themselves off of something like this? That's crazy, right? Or so one would be tempted to think. But Florida State University did some research on the topic, and their findings seem to suggest something different. A strong percentage of the people surveyed who otherwise claimed to be mentally healthy said they had experienced the exact same phenomenon. So far, the research tends to suggest that not only is this feeling more common than expected, but it also might actually be healthy. The urge to jump might very well be the brain overcompensating for some cognitive dissonance, some mixed up signals. And instead of being able to make you afraid of the height itself, the brain makes you afraid of yourself. And hopefully they're right and we don't have some sort of hidden secret death wish. But until you come to terms with those feelings, it's probably not a bad idea to consider using some sort of safety mechanism anytime you're playing on a rock wall or a tall ledge. And something like this rock climber's harness is part of a system designed to keep you safe, consisting of what's basically a seat made out of nylon webbing, heavy-duty stitching, D-rings, anchor points, and carabiners. All this attached to what might be the most important part, the cord, and all designed to safely stop or at least rapidly slow your descent if you end up taking that plummet. This all works out really well if your whole goal is to avoid taking a fall. But if the fall itself and the leap are something that you're more intrigued in, you may want to take a look at the island nation of Vanuatu. On the southern part of Pentecost Island, one of the 83 islands that make up the South Pacific nation of Vanuatu, the local population is far more interested in the custom of land diving, a ritual that involves tying tree vines to your ankles and diving headfirst off a 30-meter-high wooden tower towards the ground below. Known in the local Sa language as Nagol, or sometimes just shortened to Gol, the legend behind this brazen ritual goes something like this. One day one of the local Pentecost Island men, Tamali, was abusing his wife, and she had enough. So she went the only place she could. She ran into the woods, but Tamali followed. With Tamali in pursuit, she climbed a tall banyan tree to try and hide, but he soon found her and climbed up after. As he was climbing, she realized there was nowhere left to go, so she reached down and grabbed one of the lianas that was growing around the tree and tied it to her ankles. And in the moment Tamali tried to catch her, she jumped from the tree. Tamali didn't know she had tied vines around her ankles, and he jumped after her, but without the lianas holding him back, he fell to the ground and died. And to this day, men of the island practice this jump with lianas tied to their ankles, so women will never outsmart them again. And sure, any truth behind this legend would be nearly impossible to verify, and even the facts themselves tend to change depending on who's telling the story. But that's all kind of beside the point, because the men of Pentecost Island have been performing this jump for generations. Now, it's nearly impossible to know how this jump may have changed over the generations, or really to even know how old this tradition may be. But the most modern incarnation was first discovered on Pentecost Island shortly after World War II. And this modern-day precursor to what we now call bungee jumping can be perfectly summed up in this 2002 article intro in the National Geographic magazine by Zoltan Istvan, saying, Vanuatu's world-famous land diving ritual, the Nagol, sounds like a traditional form of bungee jumping, but after watching the first diver leap off a wooden tower, reaching upwards of 25 meters, 75 feet, and crashing into the earth below, and the 300-person crowd erupting into cheers, it's obvious that what's happening on the Pentecost Island is something radically different. Radically different is probably one of the more accurate ways to describe it. So it kind of makes sense, I guess, that a sport first described to the outside world in the 1950s would still wait another 2 decades before finally taking shape elsewhere in the world. I mean, disaster stories of foreign visitors coaxing Pentecost natives into performing the jumps out of season, where the necessary vines are really only elastic during certain parts of the year, coupled with the unsettling idea of entrusting your life to a cord tied around your ankles, yeah, the concept kind of took a little bit to warm up to. And although it's rumored that American Army soldiers may have experimented a little bit, don't they always? The first credited modern bungee jump didn't take place until April 1st, 1979, when David Kirk and Simon Keeling jumped off the Clifton Suspension Bridge, attached to homemade elastic cords that they made in their garages, in a stunt that would pave the way for modern bungee jumping. Since those first modern jumps, and largely credited to the introduction of organized commercial bungee jumping in 1986, there have now been several million successful bungee jumps across the globe. And these days, people almost seem to flock to enjoy the sensation of jumping from something high and, well, not dying, but instead slowly bouncing to a stop. But without those time-tested, seasonally elastic vines tied to their ankles, how are these maniacs even able to survive these jumps? I mean, that's pretty reckless, right? Can you ever actually safely predict how a cord might behave before you ever even hook it up and take a leap? Hook. Hooke's law is a principle in physics that tells us that a truly elastic object will stretch in direct proportion to the force that's being applied. And the equation is usually written out as F equals kx. Now this equation is super useful as far as bungee jumping is concerned, because as long as you know the stiffness of the spring or cord that you've gone ahead and attached yourself to, as well as the force that your jump has generated on that cord, you can very easily go ahead and find out how far that cord will stretch or extend, as long as you're comfortable in knowing that in the standard SI units. And here's how this all works. Since force equals mass times acceleration, bungee professionals need to take your weight in kilograms and multiply it by the gravity of the Earth, approximately, in order to find your force in newtons. They can then take that number and reinsert it into the equation, assuming they already know the spring constant or stiffness of their cord. And from here it's pretty simple. You just take the force, divide it by the spring constant, and what you have left is the amount of meters that your cord will stretch. Now, it's important to note that this number is only approximate, because rubber is extremely sensitive to temperature and load rate, meaning that in certain circumstances, it can even be considered a non-Hookean material. And this can be somewhat of a troubling fact for a first-time bungee jumper, so I made sure I went ahead and asked the Bungee America staff how the cords are designed to overcome this deficiency.
The way it works is that the cord is actually all rubber cords inside of a cotton and nylon weave.
Okay.
So what you get is, 8 strands of rubber that are they're like ribbons, and when you tie them all together, you get a solid core of rubber.
Okay.
And
it's woven inside, or is it more like Kern Mansell?
So it comes out of a machine in different strands, and then when it's together, it doesn't matter if it's weaved or not. It's just crushed together by the outer sleeve. Now, what wraps around the outer sleeve? You first get a cotton sleeve, and the cotton sleeve protects it from the abrasion of the nylon sleeve.
All right.
Now, the reason you put the nylon on is because that acts as a secondary backup, so the cord won't stretch longer than the nylon sleeve. And second of all, it helps with abrasion.
So if you haven't yet had a chance to check out that previous episode on cordage, I highly recommend giving it a look. It explains some of this at breadth. But basically that nylon sleeve he was just referring to, it's made out of some pretty tough stuff. And there's good reason why nylon is used for making cords and harnesses. I mean, essentially what nylon lacks in elasticity, it easily makes up for with its high tensile strength and comparative light weight. So even if the rubber inside your bungee cord stretches much further than anticipated, the woven nylon outer sheath will stretch very little before suddenly stopping your fall. Much more reliable than seasonally stretchy vines. So if overcoming your fears means facing them head on, then maybe overcoming that high place phenomenon, or at least coming to terms with it, means actually giving into the urge. And if that's the case, then all you really need to do to survive that jump is harness up and take a leap.
Toes off the edge, knees bent, hands front, and back and sliding it.
there's my janky setup. This setup keeps taking way longer than it really should. But looks like we got it set. Got a half an hour to go ahead and deal with these flies and keep watch so no one steals this thing.